All right, guys, welcome back to the DDT Method podcast. I am here once again with Mr. David Herrera, the solar athlete, and we're going to deep dive even further into some of the topics that we discussed last time because that was one of the best received episodes on of the podcast that I've ever done. And you guys have been begging me to bug David to get him back on the show, and he's incredibly gracious with his time. He's here again. He's got so much going on, but we're going to dive into all of these topics and more. But David, before we get rolling on it, what have you been working on recently? What's new in your life? What are some of the projects or deep dives that you've been doing?
Honestly, I'm just kind of getting back into the swing of getting ready for a competition. Probably, I would say 12 to 18 months out, shooting for a powerlifting meet, for my 40th birthday. So I'm going to be competing at 40 years old, and I'm looking to total more than I totaled 5 years ago. So in between that, there's been a lot, ups and downs, built this house behind me, that sort of stuff. And now I have a gym and I'm working towards that. So that's like my personal endeavor and deep dive that's going on there. And then the rest of the stuff is just the normal stuff that I do with coaching and everything. None of that's changed. Yeah.
Awesome. So that's a good opportunity to discuss something that I think could be beneficial to a lot of other people. So as somebody that is clearly an elite level athlete that took some time off for some other endeavors, projects and whatnot, like building a house on your own and everything else you've been working on, when you begin to set the course and start programming what you're going to be doing as far as nutrition, supplements, training itself, like where do you start to rebuild the foundation to start moving forward towards this meet?
Yeah. So for me, right. So circadian alignment and stuff, that's kind of just always been part of, what I've been. So I don't have to start at the base level. That's what I would consider the base level, right? So if I'm working with somebody new, that's the first thing we got to establish. Is your biology working correctly so that when we give you an input like training or food or PEDs or anything like that, we can have a better idea of how your body's going to react to it, right? So for me personally, it's been getting my body used to straining through all ranges of motion, right? So basically I've been training for about 6 months now, getting ready for this. And mainly it's been just moving my body with full range of motion. So it's a lot of kinetic flow type movements, right? Ground-based kinetic flow. Think of it like landmine stuff or things of that nature, where you're going to take a weight or something from the ground, produce force into the ground and put it overhead, right? I want to basically integrate all movement patterns as one, right? Because an isolation movement is one movement pattern. A compound movement is multiple movement patterns coordinated together. And I want to get really good at that again without injuring, right? Because that's the thing, right? When you're an elite athlete or somebody who's taking a break, your capabilities from a muscular perspective might be much higher than your tendon ligament capabilities, right? At the beginning, right? So a lot of people in this reintegration type period would be exceptionally predisposed to injuring themselves, especially if they're a strength athlete, right? Because they can produce a lot of force, but you haven't been kind of hammering the metal and making it super firm and ready to grasp all of the force that you can put through your body, right? So that's basically what I've been doing for the last 6 months is a lot of sled stuff, because that has no eccentric, right? So damage is less, so I can do more of it, put a lot more force through it, teaching my body to produce high end force without any eccentric, that sort of stuff. And then ground-based stuff, right? Ground-based stuff, like landmine stuff, or I like cables with full range of motion all the way through so that you're producing force from the ground, using your legs, using your torso, and all of your upper body all at the same time. I like to be very efficient with my workouts that way.
Hey guys, I hate commercials too, so I'm going to make this really, really quick. I just want to tell you about the DDT Method School Group. You see, social media has gotten really weird in recent years, and I keep getting red flagged or warned or blocked every time I mention anything that regards a milligram or a protocol or anything that seems like it's me giving you guys information on PEDs or anything related. Now, I'm not a medical professional. I'm not a doctor. This is for education purposes only, blah, 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 blah. But I want you to check out the DDT Method School Group because in there, I can give you guys exclusive content, including protocols, articles and in-depth profiles of all of your favorite PEDs and peptides, and I can give you guys the information that I can't give you on any other platform. That's the DDT Method School Group. Check the link out below. Now, you've also incorporated in the past several different modalities of training that I find that a lot of people might find them unconventional, but when you start to deep dive and realize what it is you're actually doing, it makes all the sense in the world. And I've seen you incorporating things like bands for specific rotational movements. You've even had days, I believe, that are focused almost solely on rotational movements themselves. Kbox training. I recently bought a Kbox, and it is the most hellacious torture device I've ever purchased in my life, but worth every penny. Things like this, like where do those modalities come in? Because that's a little outside the box for a lot of people's normal approach to training.
Yeah. So the rotational stuff, that I feel is a missing part in strength athletes, specifically static strength athletes, right? The reason is because, yes, you want torso rigidity, you want to be able to brace correctly, but that involves all of the muscles around your torso, right? So if you're not training rotationally and in different planes of motion and stuff like that, you're missing a big stimulus for the torso, right? So that is a lot of, when I mentioned, full range of motion, kinetic flow type movements, that's mainly what you're talking about. For the viewers is I'm incorporating a band. The band does a few things, right? It makes it so that there's more kind of like a rebound elastic event, right? When you decelerate or accelerate. So now you're incorporating the smaller muscles for balance and things of that nature in the torso and stabilizing of the hip, right? Because your adductors are working. There's a sling, right? There's a cross sling across your body, and you got to make those work together and even in a static movement. But you're going to get way more effect if you're doing it rotationally and less injury, because I'm not having to load, 500 pounds on my back or anything like that to get the same stimulus at the torso and all these stabilizing muscles. Then you have the Kbox stuff. That's unique in terms of the Kbox, and you can describe this probably now that you've experienced it, is it puts the load usually in the eccentric, right? If you do the thing correctly, right? It's almost like when you start to decelerate a normal weight, you're catching the weight and then lowering it. Whereas the Kbox is actually trying to accelerate you as you decelerate. So it's teaching you how to control the eccentric at a much greater degree. It takes a little bit of practice, but the Kbox makes it very easy. It's kind of incorporated into that machine.
I saw on a video, I believe it was on, I think it was on Juji's channel, but you had a setup with like push-up bars over the Kbox. And I thought, that seems pretty gnarly. I'm going to give that a shot. And I swear to God, it almost pulled me through the floor the first time. And I'm not using even close to the weights that you're, or not weights, the discs that you're using on that one. It's a whole other thing, but that is a phenomenal device. And I think being able to break down different training modalities based on what they're doing is something that a lot of people are missing the boat on. You even touched on before doing stuff early in your training blocks or early in the entire cycle of your training that's going to focus on taking away the eccentric, like sled pushes and whatnot, so you can train more and get higher frequency. Whereas the Kbox seems like it's the complete opposite. That's hyper focusing on the eccentric, so the frequency would have to be lower. So these things are totally different signals to the body.
Yes. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with, I think his name is Cal, the triphasic training. He wrote the book Triphasic Training. So that one, so like I incorporate way more like Kbox squats, Kbox push-ups, and Kbox deadlifts early in a powerlifting prep. So that would be like 16 weeks out, 12 weeks out. And the reason is you want to start to amplify your eccentric capabilities early in the cycle, which the Kbox will make it exaggerated compared to your normal lifts, right? So you're training more control of heavier weights without having to load the heavier weights. Normally with normal training modalities, that would be like static holds or reverse bands, things of that nature kind of accomplish those types of things where the lowering is heavier than the concentric. Well, the reason, that's actually the reason why I bought the Kbox, actually made my first Kbox myself. The reason I did that is for that effect, so that I mainly train by myself, right? I don't have a crew to load up or keep me safe under heavier than normal loads when I'm lowering. So the Kbox allows me to do that very safely. excuse me, that goes a long way in early powerlifting or even strongman, right? If you know that your competition is going to be a lot of static lifts or things of that nature, training the eccentric at a higher degree than you possibly can safely is a very beneficial thing that a lot of people know about, but with traditional methods, it's just harder to do, right? There are, unloaders, right? The hooks that you put on, those can be helpful. But again, it's kind of cumbersome, right? You lower it down and you can only do one rep at a time. Where is the Kbox, you can do 8 reps in a row and all of them will be eccentrically loaded, right? And so it does offer benefits there. And that's actually where I put the majority of my eccentric work. I'll still have it feathered in, even going up into the meat, but I'll change kind of the loading parameter. So as I get closer to the meat, my Kbox works becomes less discs so that I can become more explosive. Right. So now I'm layering those the Kbox work probably prior to my squat. Let's just talk the squat for a minute. I'll probably early in the cycle, it'll be heavy discs, really, really aggressive eccentrics. Closer to the meat, it'll be less inertia. So the movement is faster. So I can be more explosive. And I'll do that not as much volume right before squatting, right? So now I'm prepping the nervous system for really explosive work, but the eccentric is much lower. It's not quite as an aggressive eccentric. So I'm not damaging anything. And then I'll go to my normal squat workout, working up to a heavy triple or something like that.
So when we're breaking down programming like this, it's very specific to driving performance. How important would you say any of this stuff is to the individual that goes to the gym that's training for more aesthetic goals, be it bodybuilding or they just want to be super jacked? Because I feel that even though more straightforward, mundane, plain hypertrophy training is probably the best bet for them for the majority of the time, I feel a lot of people with aesthetic goals are missing out on the ability to train better or become stronger in order to train in the hypertrophy category better when it's time by not doing stuff like this. Like, how essential is this attention to programming if your goals are more aesthetic than performance?
If they're mainly aesthetic, I feel like any time. So here's the distinguishing part. When you're talking performance, what you really want is high stimulus to low injury, right? Like that's by far the thing that will keep you from performing. I don't care who you are or what the performance metrics are. You can get injured, performance drops immediately. If you are aesthetic, bodybuilding type wise, you're just trying to grow more muscle. The real goal is minimize the load as much as possible and increase the hypoxia of the tissue that you're stimulating, right? Let's talk biceps for a moment, right? If you want to stimulate the biceps to grow as much as possible, you need to send a very strong signal that that bicep needs to hold more glycogen, needs to hold more electrolytes, needs to hold more substrate to do more work. That's going to make it bigger, faster, right? It's not going to be muscle tissue related. It's going to be all the other stuff, right? And most people, I don't know, maybe 5-10 years ago, there was the whole talk of like sarcoplasmic growth versus basically water retention and stuff like that versus actual tissue growth. We know from a lot of studies that tissue growth is limited, even when you're taking PEDs, like as far as like how much you're going to grow per week or per month, right? So we're not, when you're hypertrophy focused, yes, you're trying to put on more tissue, but at first, right, if you're talking a 12-week cycle or 12-week training program, the major growth stimulus is going to be from substrates, right? So clearly sending that signal, something like a Kbox works really good because no matter the load that you use, you can use a very light load or a very heavy load as far as the inertia goes. It's like the perfect drop set, right? You are going to be able to go, and it just becomes mental at that point. How much can you suffer, right? And that is very valuable. And that's where BFR training actually kind of does similar things, right? Where you're choking off the muscle. Choking off the muscle does a couple things. It sends a clear signal that the only way that that muscle is going to continue to work is without oxygen. That's local hypoxia. That's going to bring a high demand for glycolysis, a high demand. And glycolysis means you're going to have to pull a lot of glucose into that muscle and keep it locally in that muscle. That's the pump. And that's the residual pump later, like the day later or 2 days later or whatever. And you still have that engorged muscle. That is that demand. And that signal can be sent in several ways, choking out the muscle with BFR, band training, drop sets, things like that. And the Kbox actually incorporates that right into the machine, right? So you don't even really have to think about it. You just keep going. And I'm sure you've tried that, and if you haven't, you should. Like just a simple, bicep curl with, the right bar or whatever. You put a light disc on there, and you just go until you physically can't lift your arms anymore. You'll be surprised at how many reps you get, right? Well, you get done with one set and you're going to be completely devastated. You're going to be sore for days after that. And that is the type of stimulus that I wouldn't say that you need to do it all the time, but it's beneficial in lots of different degrees to do it somewhat frequently, once a week, or especially for weak body parts or body parts that you don't have good connections with. Those types of training modalities really help augment that.
Awesome. I really do think that that's something so many people can benefit from, is approaching their training from an angle where they're looking at everything like that. And I think the simple concept of understanding like substrate utilization and training your body to store and use things better, that's so overlooked in the current day, because it seems like the vocal minority are just stressing one specific hypertrophy stimulus that's happened to be studied recently. And it's become like, well, this is the only way to go about doing this. And there's so many more options for it. Yeah. Let's shift gears to diet a little bit. And I want to go into, well, first and foremost, let's touch on this, because you presented a very unique case study with what you're doing in a long duration programming setting with a very specific goal, but still being several months out. From a performance standpoint, how are you addressing your diet? Because were you going from a situation where you weren't really structuring much while you were just dealing with life stuff and work stuff and everything like that, and then you're dialing it in? Like, how do you go about beginning to structure and progressing through a diet for performance?
Metric number one is, does there need to be weight manipulation? AKA, are you completing in a weight class? That's number one, right? If there is such a thing there, then the diet becomes pretty specific in regards to calorie load and keeping your body within certain metrics that you might determine. So that's number one. For me, that is the case. I'm not looking to get bigger. I've already done that in my previous decade of training, right? I already accrued the muscle tissue that's going to probably manifest in the goal that I want at the end, right? So that's going to be dependent on that. Do you need to be bigger? And is there a weight class metric involved, right? If there is, then it's basic. I'm going to say it this way because most people will understand it, but it's a little bit more complicated than this. The basic calories in versus calories out. Maintain that body. Whatever calorie load does that gets checked off. Then the intricacies come in, how many carbs, fats, and nutrition, right, you're going to require for that. And that's going to be dependent on a couple things. Your environment, where do you live, right? So I live in Wyoming and I'm going into winter. Most of my food right now is going to be heavily focused towards more carnivore-esque type diets, because that keeps inflammatory responses low in my current setup of where I live. If you live somewhere else, that might not look that way. It might look like a traditional bodybuilding type diet, right? Where there's a lot of carbohydrate load, you're replenishing substrate a lot and that sort of stuff. So the two things that I kind of really focus on when I'm planning somebody's diet is that. Who are they? Do they need to get bigger? Do they need to maintain, or do they need to get smaller? That determines the amount of food. The types of food will be determined by who you are, like which ones, and most people kind of intuitively call this like which foods agree with you, that you digest well, that don't bloat you, that sort of stuff. That's the basic stuff, right? And for the most part, if you've been in this for longer than a year, you kind of realize that there's going to be foods that agree with you. There's going to be foods that don't. That's actually dictated by your environment and your lifestyle, right? Like if you're somebody who works a manual job versus somebody who sits indoors a lot, and how much, sunlight you get is going to determine how well you digest certain carbohydrates. So that's going to be the main manipulator that I use, is carbohydrates low or high, depending on season, if you live somewhere where there's 4 seasons versus not, and that sort of thing. I could go into more detail, but we would kind of need to pinpoint an actual athlete to get very detailed. And then that really wouldn't do anybody any good unless, I was working with them. But if you want me to dive into anything more specific, just let me know.
So, we did touch a little bit last time on the differences that sunlight will make specifically to digestion and utilization of different nutrients that you take in. Can you break down a little bit more, like what exactly is going on? Is that something that has to do with photons from the sun and subsequent transport of electrons? But like in that case, is it better in a more glycolytic environment, like taking in a lot of carbs? Like what's actually going on between sunlight and how we store and utilize food?
So sunlight is going to dictate a lot of how the mitochondria are able to function. So let's back up just a little bit. Most carbohydrates are going to be processed outside of the mitochondria, right? So that's number one. It's going to be through the glycolysis, the PPP cycle. Those are all done outside of the mitochondria. Fatty acid oxidation is done in the TCA cycle inside of the mitochondria. So the biggest player here in terms of sunlight is how well you can burn fat and how well you can utilize carbohydrates is going to be dictated purely on the amount of sunlight that you get just residually, right? Like a walk outside, for example, is going to set you up to be able to digest fats very well. We have some studies on that they're not in nutrition, right? These studies are done on what's called quantum biology type studies and stuff like that, where we know that the TCA cycle doesn't spin in one direction. It can spin backwards too. And that is what most people would call a Warburg shifted metabolism. Now, we know that there are certain parts of your body that use that all the time, like your eyes, for example. Your eyes use a Warburg shifted metabolism all the time because they have to regenerate all the time, right? They're the fastest regenerating tissue in the whole body. And so when you get that concept, what that means is you can shift how well you digest fats and stuff by how much infrared and UV light interact with you and that you produce through the form of biophotons. So for example, cold exposure will dramatically increase the amount of fatty oxidation you can do if your biology is running correctly, meaning you don't have a lot of like electromagnetic field pollution where you live, right? Because though the mitochondria are exactly that, they are energy transformers, and the energy they're transforming is electrons. You can receive electrons from food, from sunlight, from temperature change gradients and stuff like that. And so you're going to be able to like, for example, right now I'm getting really, really cold. It's like 20 degrees outside or whatever. And so I can dramatically eat a whole lot more animal protein and animal fats at this stage of the year for me than I can in the summer without getting fat because I'm exposing my body to that temperature gradient change. The mitochondria are interpreting that correctly. And then that makes it so that the TCA cycle can really ramp up. And so now that food input, which is going to be fats, I can use a whole lot more of that than I can in the winter. So I tend to be leaner in the winter when I'm doing that type of protocol. And the protocol basically means I get cold frequently throughout the day, right? Right now, I'm doing it right now, first thing in the morning. It's literally sunrise right now. And I'll do it maybe one or two more times throughout the day, 20 minutes here and there. That sends the proper signals to my biology that when I ingest fats, I'm going to utilize them at a much more efficient rate than say in the summer. You flip that around in the summer, I'm going to be able to use carbohydrates way more efficiently because I'm getting a lot more solar photons from a UVB, UVA perspective. And that's going to essentially make it so that it's kind of like the barcode on food, right? If you take a Walmart food and you try to scan it at a Kroger store, you're not going to get this. It's not going to know what to do with it, right? The machine's not going to ring it up. It's the same thing, right? I'm tuning my biology through the environment to expect what to come in, right? That's kind of the easiest, no science way to describe it. Does that make sense?
No, it makes perfect sense. Now, going a step further, let's say you want to manipulate these things based on your specific goals that might not fall at the most opportune times. So let's say I'm in a warmer climate, and I'm in Florida. It gets a little chilly in the winter, but chilly is subjective, I suppose. But let's say it's like the middle of the summer and I want to focus on heavy fat utilization. I just want to get super lean. If I were to incorporate a more controlled setting of cold exposure, let's say cold plunge, how would I schedule that for individual duration and frequency and temperature? Like, how often do I need to do this to give myself that effect without just being chronically outdoors in cold weather? So, how do I kind of use it to
Yeah.
balance hot temperature?
Yeah. So luckily, right, we do live in the modern world, lots of modern inventions, cold plunges, cryotherapy, that sort of stuff. You can put those in terms of cold, you can stimulate that effect basically by getting cold, depending on the modality. If it's a cold plunge, that's going to happen very fast. 3 minutes at like 55 degrees, that's going to set that up pretty quickly. And so maybe, 30, 40 minutes after that cold plunge, you can eat a very high fat meal, for example, and you're going to utilize that better. If you're trying to get leaner, like you described, you could just induce the effect by getting in a cold plunge and then expending a little bit of energy, right? Something that, I do here that you could do, even, in the summertime is doing some kind of aerobically intense training. And by aerobically intense training, most people would just say cardio. You could do it that way, right? Like I get on an elliptical in the cold and that works, right? You're going to have calorie expenditure with a high degree of efficiency of fat utilization by tuning the mitochondria in that direction. Now, to exploit it in a synthetic way, like it's summertime and I'm trying to exploit that same dynamic, it would just basically be like a cold plunge, 3 minutes. And while you're warming up, you could do some aerobic work, or you could even make it like you could start the training phase of that by doing box breathing or something that's going to create a high demand of oxygen transfer from the mitochondria, from the blood into the mitochondria to burn or oxidize the fats through fatty acid oxidation. So you could induce a cold event, cryotherapy, cold plunge, whatever, and just practice. And I mean really practice high degree hypoxic breathing, right? So that's box breathing. So like emptying the lungs, excluding it out, holding the breath, and then filling the lungs back up, holding the breath at the top. That is a lot harder to do. If you really treat it like a training session, right? Just sit in a chair and try that. If you can make it to 5 minutes, that's that's a very, very hard training session. You're going to be sweating at the end of that. You're going to feel like you can't breathe. You're going to feel like you're working out because it is a workout, and you're doing it in a way that's influencing biology without really taxing the body in any way. You can do that during cold exposure. That's a little bit harder. I can barely do that sometimes if I'm really training that hard. But after cold exposure, when you got your bearings straight and it's only been like 5 minutes and you're just barely starting to warm back up, that's a perfect time to kind of induce that. And then you get a feel for what that should feel like as far as like how your body's feeling while you're doing it. And then you can ramp that intensity up by actually doing work. It could be, a jog or an elliptical or whatever after. Um, it could be a training session, but for getting lean, that's not required, right? It's just the amplification of fatty acid utilization. You would still need to be active, right? There's still the whole concept of burning the actual substrate. But it starts with delivering oxygen to a high degree to the mitochondria and the mitochondria burning that.
Now, when you say box breathing, do you mean like the more classical approach, 5 second in, 5 second hold, 5 second out, 5 second hold? Or do we want to like progressively overload that and just do it for extreme amounts of time?
That's where you would start, right? That would be like the intro, right? If you go read about box breathing, that's kind of where it's going to be. That's the intro. That would be like, taking somebody to the gym and just showing them the ropes, right? Of like, hey, this is this exercise, this is how it feels. And then, so it'd be 5 seconds down, 5 seconds up, getting that rhythm, right? And once you have that rhythm, start expanding it, right? Now it's 10 seconds in, 10 seconds out, and then slowly increasing that. And I can get to the point where a full exhale takes about 5 seconds, and then I can hold it with no air in my lungs for about another 5 seconds, then another 5 or 10 seconds up, hold it there for another, you can really start to expand one breath cycle from 10 seconds all the way up to 30 seconds and beyond if you get really good at this.
And I know that also has like a multitude of health benefits in general. So that's definitely something that a lot of people should be looking into if they're not doing it already. Now, if we're going to switch gears a little bit, and now let's say that we have a cold environment, but training goals, training demands, whatever it might be, dictates super high carbohydrate intake. Can we supplement the lack of the light and the heat with things like infrared, sauna, with red light therapy, or do we need like full spectrum UV as much as possible?
Um, I wouldn't say that you need full spectrum UV, but UV added to red light will enhance that. Right. So basically red light therapy, whether that's the newer tanning beds that are actually red light beds now, you could do that. Right. The more of it that you can get, the better, for 100%. Now, there's a couple things that you want to take into account in terms of red light therapy. You need multiple frequencies of the red light, not just one. Right. So you kind of have to look, talk to the manufacturer or whatever and make sure that you're getting at least two frequencies in the 600 nanometer range and at least another one or two frequencies in the 800 nanometer range. Those are the minimums that I would say. If you have a device that has those frequencies, it's going to be very effective. And then you layer in specifically UVA frequencies. So that's going to be in the higher 300. So that's going to be 360, 380, 390. And if you can supplement some UVA in those frequencies, that's going to be beneficial to turn on mTOR, which is going to then be beneficial for amplifying that carbohydrate use. Now, is it going to be the same as in the summer? No, but it's going to be very similar. You're going to be able to hack that situation that you just described.
Now, with the ease of access to this technology that a lot of us have these days, where's like the bell curve? Where do we know what's enough, what's too much? I mean, a lot of manufacturers will say 20 minutes at a time, but sometimes we know they're kind of erring on the more cautious side of things. I've got two red light panels that hit the frequencies that we need in my office, and I'm in my office all day. Now, I'll try to do about 20 minutes in the morning, 20 minutes in the evening, but it'd be super easy for me to do 40, 60, 80, 100 minutes at a time because it's a simple matter of just turning it on and continuing to do some work. What's the limit? Like, how far can we push it, and when's going to be too much?
So if you're in a cold environment, you will notice that you almost can't get enough of it. If you're in a warm environment, right, temperatures are always static, 60 and above or whatever. There is a bell curve, right? And so all light therapies operate on a bell curve. And actually most therapies do, where once you hit a threshold, you'll start to have not necessarily negatives, but you don't get any more out of it. Now, if you push it way beyond that, you might get some negatives, right? So when it comes to red light therapy, especially if you're in a cold environment, I would say you could kind of do exactly what you just described. You could kind of have it in the background pointed at you or kind of in your direction pretty much all day. That's kind of what I do when I have to, like if it's snowing outside, I'm not going to be outside. If it's raining outside, I'm not going to be outside. But I have basically probably a very similar setup to you. I have my infrared panels, they're pointed at me, and I could easily get infrared light therapy for a couple hours. No big deal. And I don't experience a drop. And what you'll notice is this: when you're doing infrared light therapy or light therapies indoors, the bell curve looks like this. You know you hit too much or that you had enough when you feel overstimulated. And I don't mean like caffeinated. I mean, it's almost like you feel edgy. It's almost like you feel like you need to move more. And that's actually what these therapies are doing. They're amplifying mitochondrial production. And it quickly goes from, oh, I feel great, I feel really energized, to, man, I feel a little anxious and I feel like I need to go outside. And the reason is because you're not allowing for how normally these would operate, which is, let's forget about, the access to all these technologies and just say, okay, how would this normally operate? I would be outside to be able to get all these frequencies, right? And if you're outside, more than likely, you're going to be activated to move, right? So think of it like when you're at the beach. You go to the beach, especially if it's like a whole day at the beach, right? You show up, it's a little bit cold in the morning and whatnot. you're getting sunlight, you're feeling pretty good, but you feel kind of, how would I say, calm and passive at the beginning part of the day. And then towards the middle of the morning, towards the middle of the day, and I know that you live in Florida, so you've probably experienced this. That's when you start to feel energized. You start to feel like, hey, let's go play. Let's go jump in the water. Let's go do something, right? Play football or whatever on the beach. You start to get that feel of like, I just need to move around and it feels good to move around. That's the feeling that you'll get when you start getting to that top end of, hey, I've had enough light therapy indoors. And you kind of have to do two things. One of two things: either cut it off, right, turn the stuff off, or start exercising. It's almost a cue of like, this is my the perfect thing that I would say if you're trying to kind of hack it and you're indoors is start using it and time when you start to get that feeling, right? It could be 90 minutes, it could be 2 hours. It is going to be dependent on the individual and your circumstances. And then you schedule maybe your workout at the tail end of receiving that so that you can output all of that excess energy that you've created through photon exchange and electron flow. Does that make sense?
Yes, 100%. Now, how would we cycle in controlled heat exposure? Would that be approached in the same type of setting where maybe we need more carbohydrate intake and we're supplementing with red lights, and that would be the time to use more sauna? Or how would we program that in? Is that something that operates on a similar basis? Is it different? Like, what's the best way to use that if we have unlimited access?
Yeah, it would operate on a very similar thing. So heat exposure. Now, if you're already in a hot environment, say, or it's summertime, or you live somewhere where it's warm all the time, heat exposure should be one of these things that you become cautious with, not necessarily because of it can make you feel sick, essentially, right? Like heat stroke is, the thing that happens at the end of too much heat production, right? So there is a clear of once you start sweating quite a bit, right? You've been sweating for 10, 15 minutes, right? Let's just talk sauna for a minute, right? That's kind of the modality that most people are going to use to expose themselves to excess heat. That's what you'll feel like. And I usually cut it off at about 20 minutes. Like actual heat shock exposure is going to be after about sweating for about 20 minutes is the maximum that I like. And the reason for that is overdoing that then down regulates that whole system because now your system is trying to expend energy it's trying to waste energy, right? Because you're putting way too much energy into the system. You start sweating, you're going to start to feel a little bit ill if that goes too long. That I tell people to be a lot more cautious with in terms of too much it's a very short time frame before it becomes too much. Now, as far as like how that intertwines in terms of nutrition, I would actually say when you induce heat shock exposure, you're actually probably not going to want to eat much of anything for a couple hours after. You're going to want to focus more on anything that does the opposite. So that's going to be ice water, right? Like actually drinking ice water and stuff like that. Most people kind of think, okay, I'm lowering the body temperature and stuff like that. And yes, it is doing that. But what it's also doing is it's replenishing the battery that absorbs the heat. Water is a red light chromophore, right? So if you pull in a bunch of water through just, electrolyte drink with ice water in it or whatever, what you're going to do is you're going to develop a bigger heat sink to absorb more of that energy. Because I went through this effort of like getting in the sauna, getting all this photon energy and heat energy into me. And then I get too much. I start sweating. That cascade starts to go of, I'm going to dump energy and dump energy. Once I get to that point, I actually want to preserve most of that energy. So I'm going to provide a substrate that can hold on to that. Water is the best one by far. That leads me to a concept about water that a lot of people ignore, which is water is not the same everywhere. There's something called deuterium. Deuterium allows the water to either, the best way to describe it would be preserve more of the energy in the water versus dissipating more of it, right? And this concept has to do with the deuterium content of the water. The lower the deuterium content, the faster enzymatic processes are going to happen in the body. And the higher the deuterium content of the water, the slower the processes are going to happen. So drinking deuterium depleted water along with heat therapy is a big hack. It gets a little expensive, but it is a big hack for preserving all of that energy substrate and then making it useful for biology for basically the rest of the day.
Now, are there any alternatives to deuterium depleted water just based on the fact that it is rather pricey? I've looked into it several times, and it's one of those things where I've bought it before, and it's one of the things that at this stage I'm still like, I don't know if I can make this my primary water intake because that's a little pricey. Like, what other options do we have?
Unfortunately, to do to make the processes that it changes are completely dependent on the deuterium load. So there really isn't a substitute. That's actually kind of the problem with it. Because there's the hydrogen tablets and all of that type of stuff that are, in the hydrogen electrolysis bottles and stuff, all of those. The problem is you don't have control of the deuterium content of the hydrogen, right? Now, if somebody were to make a tablet that is actually deuterium depleted hydrogen, that could be an alternative. The problem is I haven't found somebody who's actually done that, right? So we're on the cusp of, think of it this way, like people know about the deuterium depleted water, people make the deuterium depleted water, but they haven't dug into advancing that to make it cheaper to make or more easily available at a lower price point. Now, there are people looking into that and figuring that out. That might be something that comes in the future and probably not too far off, actually.
Definitely something to keep an eye out for. I do feel like every year we're making more and more innovations, and this is getting more popular. People are more aware of their health, so these things are becoming more readily accessible. So even the technologies, the panels and cold plungers and whatnot have come down in price in recent years. So definitely something worth people keeping an eye out for. Now, staying in kind of the topic of nutritional approaches to things, maybe I should say leaning back towards that a little bit, I want to talk about leptin. Because leptin is one of those things that, we all hear the word, but it's very, very misunderstood. So where does somebody's like level of leptin and where does the balance between leptin and ghrelin come in to affect how healthy we are, our performance and longevity, our, optimization towards our goals? Like, first of all, what is it? How do we manipulate it? What's happening to it in a normal Western diet? Like, what's the deal with leptin?
So leptin is kind of unique. Number one, it's located inside fat cells. Okay. So that is the number one thing. That's the location of where that leptin is going to be held. Now, it's not doing anything there, right? It's in fat cells. It gets released from fat cells when UV light interacts with it. Okay. Now that UV light does not have to come from the sun. That can come locally from cold exposure. It actually induces infrared light and biophotons in the UV range that releases the leptin from the fat, right? So that's where you're going to get, you can get on Life Extension and get the leptin, how much leptin is in your blood. That's only telling you how much got released into the blood from the fat cells. That's not doing anything yet. Leptin in the blood then should go to the hypothalamus while you sleep, right? This is the key component, which is why I actually don't use the leptin blood panel, because you don't know if the person is being interacted with negatively at night by, I don't know, sleeping with a phone next to their head or sleeping next to an airport, right? They might live next to an airport or something like that. So, the amount of leptin in the blood is one thing, but it's not doing anything until it interacts with the hypothalamus. Once it interacts with the hypothalamus, the leptin, the amount of leptin, tells the body very accurately how much fat, how much energy does this person have on their body. And then that sets the stage for the next day, how much energy you're going to have, how much appetite you're going to have. So that's going to incorporate with ghrelin and how much output that gets when you eat, all of that. That's all going to be dictated by how much leptin actually got led into the hypothalamus and accurately told the brain, this is how much energy this person has. Think of it like, are you familiar with like racing NASCAR or anything like that? Any racing type of sports?
Vaguely enough to follow an analogy.
Right. So the tracks change all the time, right? There's going to be a need for different tires. There's going to be a need for a different setup of suspension and all of that. That's coordinated by the environment, right? What am I going to be racing in, right? That's leptin's job. It's going to tell the body how much intake this person has by how much fat they have. It's going to tell them how much muscle mass. All of those actually dictate and are incorporated into this leptin thing, because the leptin being released from the fat is going to be put into the blood. The blood is going to interact with all the other things that are going on in your body, how much work you've done, how much stress you're under. So the blood contains all of that information. It's being integrated into leptin. That's why it gets released during UV stimulation, collects all that information. Then at night, when you go to sleep, that's going to deliver all of that information. So think of it like I'm part of a race team and I show up to the track a week before and I do all my measurements and look at the track and be like, hey, this is what's going to set this up for success. That's leptin, right? I send a little email to the crew and boom, the crew starts to set up the car appropriate for the track. That's what leptin is actually doing, right? So it's something you can manipulate, especially the release of leptin from the fats into the blood through cold exposure, sunlight exposure, those types of things. That's accurately releasing the information. Then the tricky part with the leptin is that nighttime thing. That's going to be more dictated by your environment, your sleeping environment specifically. And that is actually a concept that there isn't a lot of studies on. That's where we need to decipher that. And there is vaguely, like when they discovered leptin, they found out that. And that's why they didn't develop leptin. They developed GLP-1s instead, because they tried injecting leptin. What they found, it was hit or miss. The reason why it's hit or miss is because it's not how much leptin is in the blood. It's how much leptin interacts with the hypothalamus. You see, you don't have control of that, right? That's controlled by your sleeping environment, right? So when, and that was clearly panned out in the studies. They just didn't think about it from that. Hey, there's also the receiving end, right? Where and when that gets received. So instead they found, oh, well, leptin coordinates GLP-1 and ghrelin, right? So they developed GLP-1 because that's downstream of that interaction, right? So even if that interaction doesn't happen at night, you can still send a strong energy intake suppression by a GLP-1. So it's downstream of that, right? But here's the thing, all biological process work in both directions. So if I give you a whole bunch of GLP-1, but you have a poor lifestyle, you don't release a lot of leptin into the bloodstream, or you have a poor sleeping environment, now those other parts, right? Because leptin doesn't just control, GLP-1, it controls energy output and controls a whole bunch of other things, right? Like I described with the car analogy, it's not just one thing, it's several things, right? So you might give somebody GLP-1 and it lowers their appetite, but it didn't change anything else about their biology. So somebody can start to fall apart from a depression standpoint, right? Because under normal circumstances, forget about everything that I just said about GLP-1, just leptin set you up for, hey, this person has plenty of fat on them. They have a lot of physical demands. We don't feel, leptin is coordinating with the brain. We don't feel that this person needs more food, but they can still output a bunch of energy. So the person's going to wake up fully energized, be able to work out really hard, and not have a lot of hunger. That happens to some people just naturally all the time because they have a good lifestyle, right? Think of a farmer that gets out and works from sun up to sundown, all the energy they need, and they maybe ate twice, right? That's very common for somebody who has that lifestyle. But that, and they have a good mood and all of that type of thing, right? All of that was coordinated by leptin, every single bit of that. But when you just give somebody a GLP-1, you only suppress the appetite or a couple other, things related to energy intake, but you didn't change any of their neurological capabilities, like how much dopamine they produce, how much willpower they'll have, all of that type of thing. You didn't change any of that, right? So then you're not eating very much food, but you're slightly depressed because all these other things aren't being changed either. Those can be changed independently through good lifestyle choices. So something that I have noticed with, this flood of GLP-1 into the market and all of that. It's readily available. You don't even have to go to a doctor these days. Let's just get real with that. You can get GLP-1 right now, right? I could just get on the internet and order it. A lot of people are hopping on this train because it suppresses appetite, but they forget about all this other biology that leptin should be controlling and GLP-1 doesn't, right? So that's when pairing GLP-1s with proper lifestyle changes really starts to shine. Like I've even gone to the point of having people come to me for like weight loss and stuff like that. They have already taken something like trizepatide or semaglutide, but they've gotten all the negatives that everybody talks about, right? As far as like semi-depressed, not feeling well, just no energy, that sort of stuff, even though they're not eating very much and they're clearly losing weight, but they're losing muscle tissue, they're losing motivation, they're not really feeling like doing all the normal stuff. The reason is because they're not setting up their biology to do all those other things. They are unaware, and doctors are really unaware, that GLP-1 is like a sliver of what leptin does, and all these other things are being neglected when you just take a GLP-1.
But that if somebody's not responding well to any of these GLP drugs, that simply managing leptin with these environmental factors first, so their sun exposure, hot heat exposure, cold exposure, and then sleep architecture, something as, I don't want to say it's simplistic because there's a lot that goes into that, but something as simplistic as that can change their entire systemic response to these GLPs?
So I've seen it more than once, actually a few dozen times.
Now, how is leptin interacting with the other pathways being manipulated by some of these drugs like GIP and like glucagon?
So that's actually, so again, let's talk the evolution of GLP-1, right? So we have semaglutide, just GLP-1, trizepatide, GLP-1, and GLP. Retatrutide is GLP-1, GLP, and glucagon, okay? This is what science, or medical science, I call it, is kind of catching on to. That leptin does way more than GLP-1. It coordinates glucagon, it coordinates GLP. So they start adding more, right? They start adding, and they started figuring out, oh, well, you just gives GLP-1, you end up with all these other side effects. We manage those by adding this other little bit, the GLP. And then, okay, well, those two do this, but we still have this low blood glucose being uncoordinated. So then they add in the glucagon so that you can release more glucose from the liver and all of that. That is starting to become closer, not remotely 100%, but closer to all of the different integrations that leptin would already be doing. You see what I'm saying?
So if somebody comes to you and let's say they've been using like retatrutide is probably the trendiest one. So somebody's using retatrutide, a stage 3 manipulating GLP, GIP, and glucagon, and there's just saying there's a ton of hype on this and it's working okay, I guess, but I'm just not getting that much from it. I feel a little crappy on it maybe. What is your quote unquote leptin prescription for them? Like, how do you actually have them address that, assuming that they're doing nothing right to begin with?
Yeah. Okay. So that's a key. And that's usually how I go. I'm assuming the reason you're getting a bad outcome or not the one you want is because you're not really doing much of any of these other things. So it starts with the start of the day. Are you getting outside and just getting some level of outside stimulation, whatever your environment is? So that could be, if you live in Florida, that's going to be just sunrise and just generally seeing outdoors for 20 minutes in the first hour and a half of the day. Step one. Step two happens at night. Sleep architecture is a key component to making sure that the leptin gets into the brain correctly, so that, because see, that's the thing, right? The excuse me, the retatrutide has these 3 substrates in it. They're standardized. What that means is it has a specific amount of GLP-1, a specific amount of GLP, and a specific amount of glucagon. You might need more glucagon to operate correctly, right? You might need more GLP to operate correctly, or vice versa, right? The ratio for each person is going to be individual, right? That's what this drug can't do. right? So you are going to provide some of that. And then if you set up your day, your lifestyle inputs, now your body can make up for any deficiencies in any one of those three and the multiple more that are going to come by doing that, right? So it starts with get outside in the day, specifically the morning first, and multiple times throughout the day, one or two more times, right? And it doesn't have to be very long, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Then the more important part is make sure that some of that leptin or as much of it as possible gets into the brain, the hypothalamus. That is going to be coordinated by your sleep arrangements. And that starts with eliminating as much disruption of melatonin at the beginning of the night. That's going to be blue light blocking glasses. That's going to be reducing overhead lighting, changing it and making it lower. And the reason for that is how the eye is set up. You have a lot more blue light receptors on the bottom of the eye. So any light from above is going to intensely interact with those and suppress leptin way harder than if the light is coming from below. So just changing overhead lighting to to lamp lighting, the direction of the light is going to change that reaction. Then changing the color of the light is going to change that reaction. So basically it should look like this. As the night happens, right? As you eat dinner, sun's going to set. You want to replicate what's going on outside. You want the colors of your lights to go amber and then red. And you want it to lower. You want it to go from above to below. And that's how you need to start your evening to set up a proper melatonin response. Then, when the melatonin response is crucial for modern living, when the melatonin response happens, aka you start to get groggy, that is telling you your body is ready. Your body is ready to start this nighttime switchover, right? Because you're essentially operating two processes, right? Think of it like yin and yang or heads and tails or whatever, right? It's the same coin, but it's clearly a different phase, right? And that is the key component. Under normal circumstances, you don't choose to go to sleep. Your body puts you to sleep, right? Because it's activating that switch. Most people think that that's a bad thing and try to ignore it because it's all about production and, I got to send this new email off or tomorrow or whatever, right? There's a lot of things left undone in the evening and people disrupt that melatonin response, right? But if you went through the effort of changing your lighting and changing all of this stuff and you get that melatonin response, instead of thinking, oh, there's a couple things I got to do, that's actually the cue of, hey, my body is ready. It's done everything that it needs to do to set me up to get good sleep so that I release T4, release growth hormone. And after that growth hormone release, which should happen around midnight or about 3 or 4 hours into sleep, then leptin gets let into the hypothalamus. So the large melatonin response at the very early part of the evening, it usually happens at about 90 minutes to 2 hours after the change of lighting. You'll get this aggressive melatonin response. You start to get a little bit groggy. You might be reading a book or whatever, right? Or just hanging out and you start to feel a little bit dozy. That's the key component of, oh, it's time to shut off the lights, get in my bed and let my body do its thing. That little concept goes a long way. Now, if people are already doing that, right? Because I deal with people that kind of know a lot of this stuff already and are doing some of this or all of it, then that's when you start to get into the intricacies of uh, EMF and figuring specifics out. Like I literally just went to somebody's house just last weekend to monitor their whole house because something was off in their house. What we found out is her husband had just upgraded their Wi-Fi network, literally. He just bought new Wi-Fi routers and new access points and put them all over the house. He happened to put one in their bedroom, right? And so we cut that out. Not even 3 days later, she's like, "Oh, I'm sleeping a lot better again, once again." Right? And that's what I'm saying. It can be as simple as something like that changed, and that disturbs that sleep cycle. So once you're doing a lot of this stuff, I'm not saying that's going to solve it all because there's these little things that we don't think about that also disturb that melatonin and sleep architecture cycle. Does that make sense?
1000%, yes. And it's funny because in breaking that down, this can absolutely be an addition that can take somebody that's responding negatively to a GLP drug and completely change the course of their response to that drug. But from what it sounds like, you could also do this for somebody that's not doing it, that hasn't even touched a GLP, and they can have a similar result. It seems like it's doing all the same things if you go from having dismanaged leptin or dysregulated leptin into something that's more balanced with what it should naturally be just by manipulating it.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. That is what I have discovered with like actually studying and implementing that. That's the key component of like science. Is it's not what the study says. That's not science. Science is, okay, this is what the study says should be happening. Why is it not happening or happening differently in this person? And that has to do with observing, right? And actually looking at the inputs, the levers that change all of this, like, sleep architecture. We know that sleep architecture dictates how leptin's going to interact with the hypothalamus. Well, what affects sleep architecture? Lighting, electromagnetic fields, the temperature of your room, all of those types of things. So then you can start dialing in those levers and get the right response.
Have you done any reading or looking into green light exposure? Because I've been seeing a lot of stuff on basically ocular absorption of green light and its effect on driving a parasympathetic shift in tone. Is that anything that you've had a chance to look into yet?
Yeah. Works excellent for headaches. Excellent for headaches. You get a headache that's just starting and get a little bit of green light in you. That'll clear that up right away. It also stabilizes hemoglobin. And that's actually kind of not that surprising when you think about it. Nature has a lot of green in it when there's a lot of UV and when there's a lot of sunlight exposure. That is actually deeply integrated into some of the processes at the opsin level, right? And that's has to do with opsin 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. These are what's called chromophores, right? They absorb specific frequencies of light that then flip certain switches that have to do with neurological stuff, mainly, right? And so that's going to be a lot of what green light does, but it's not full. It's never should be, and this is what I tell everybody. You should never take something like green light or something like that. It can be used in situations like headaches and stuff like that very effectively, but don't immediately start isolating it and just giving yourself a bunch of it, because that's not actually how it exists in nature, right? Same thing with UV light therapy. When I say, add in a little bit of UVA to your infrared, I'm never going to tell you to use UVA by itself, right? Because that's not how it exists in nature. Now, infrared's different. A lot of people don't know this. So sunlight is actually like 90% infrared, starting from like 600 nanometers all the way to 3000. And the last 10% is everything else. That's the colors of the rainbow. That's the UV light, all of that. That's that last 10%, right? So where these other colors, green, UV, purple, they all have different effects in the body, but they are very potent at very small doses, right? So those therapies, green, UV, all of those, they should be very, very limited in the amount that you use them, like frequency or duration or intensity.
Now, with the effects on hematology of the green, is that oxygenating your blood? Is that affecting that? Like, how is it affecting the hemoglobin?
Yeah, so it's affecting hemoglobin by affecting iron. Iron has two states. A lot of people, you probably do, but a lot of people don't know that. Iron is actually can operate in a +2 state, and that means that it can take in oxygen and release oxygen very easily. And it also operates in the +3 state. And that's when it sequesters oxygen, oxygen. It can't let it go, right? That is where green stabilizes hemoglobin, meaning it flips it. It flips it from a +3 state back into a +2 state. Now, think about this in this way. I don't know if you've ever read any work by Robert O. Becker, but the body
I have.
electric. Okay, body electric.
Yep, that's on my shelf right back there, actually.
Yeah. Okay. Now, he doesn't talk about the light or anything like that, but he talks about this specific thing that I'm going to talk about. You can induce regeneration, let me reword that. Regeneration is induced in a hypoxic environment. right? So when you become hypoxic, you set yourself up for regeneration. That happens every night, or should happen every night. That's actually my suspicion of why a lot of bodybuilders, or a lot of like, and not even bodybuilders, but just in general, a lot of people become hypoxic at night and start developing sleep apnea. Why? Because they're developing too much oxygen into the system and they're not able to turn on the regeneration process at night. So the body reacts by limiting oxygen that you breathe in, because that's the only step it has left, right? Because you haven't stabilized hemoglobin during the day. So you're always hypoxic during the day. And then at night, you still are at the same level of hypoxia, but the body's trying to regenerate. So it needs lower hypoxia than that. So it starts giving you sleep apnea. Now, if you induce full spectrum light during the day, boom, you all of a sudden jump up the iron from a +3 to a +2. Now you're super oxygenated all day long. And now there's a clear cutoff when that light goes away, because now that iron goes from a +2 back to a +3 and releases less oxygen, right? It's doing it through a chemistry process that's dictated by light. So in other words, light can dictate chemistry just by how it's being induced. And if you are missing that big jump up in oxygen delivery during the day, because there isn't any green or full spectrum light in your life, then the only option to lower it further is by limiting the oxygen intake.
Now, this stuff is honestly, it's truly like the missing link that people don't spend enough time trying to understand, that can be a massive needle mover. These are small hinges that swing massive doors, and people don't seem to realize it. Now, I want to be respectful of your time. I don't want to dive into a gigantic topic that in and of itself could be a whole other podcast, but we brought up Robert O'Becker and the Body Electric. Give me a little bit of your thought process on the benefits of other frequency therapies, things like PEMF, Leptin coils, all this old Tesla technology, because it's having a bit of a resurgence right now. And I know it can be leveraged for benefit, but what's actually going on? And in your opinion, what's the best use case scenario?
Yeah. So PMF and all these, basically they're raw electricity that's being pulsed at different frequencies or different ranges of frequencies, right? So the way that I like to describe this, and again, it's making a resurgence, which just means that people are noticing that it has effects. It's not detailed enough to actually leverage it for anything really specific yet, right? This is kind of like in the deuterium depleted water realm. It's has effects. People are noticing them. People are developing technology, but it's too raw right now to be very super effective for anything specific. It's very broad still. And what I mean by that is this: you and I are open systems. All living things on this planet are open systems. We are not a closed loop system. So what that means is there is not one input or two inputs and then an output. That's not what happens. We essentially can receive hundreds of inputs at once, and our biology, our body, then filters that and creates hundreds of outputs. Okay. So the analogy that I'll use for that is coffee. I used it earlier, right? Which is what you can put the same coffee and change the filter by, the amount that it opens up or the type of material that it's made out of. And that changes the coffee at the other end, the way it's going to taste, the way it's going to hit you, all of that type of stuff. That is what your body is doing with all electrical inputs, not just these things like Tesla coils and all of that type of stuff. All electrical inputs are filtered through the body. So we'll stick to PMF because it's easier to talk about and more people kind of know what that is, right? So a PMF pad is just an electrical inputs, raw electrical inputs, pulse at specific frequencies. If we get to the point where this is studied more, there could be a time where you could be able to tune the intensity and the frequency of that PMF to do a specific thing in the brain versus the nervous system versus muscle tissue. We don't know those effects yet, right? So it's very raw. We can't be precise with the input that's slamming against your body. But what we can do right now, what it's useful for is things like joint and tendon and ligament, not restoration, but like say you have like a shoulder problem. You don't really know what's going on. Most people would, default to like physical therapy or manual manipulation or massages or things like that. But you're counting on that person to be an expert in your body. But you and I are built different, right? So who knows your body better than your own body? So a PMF pad essentially is doing that. It slams all this electricity at specific frequencies against that tissue, and your tissues, if they're intact and working correctly, basically rearrange themselves, for lack of a better way to say it, correctly post the treatment. So basically, think of it like I'm taking a raw energy, slamming it against my body, and my body's the filter. And if it's appropriate, it's going to filter it correctly, and the right output's going to come out the other side. So basically, you're kind of just throwing a whole bunch of stuff at yourself and hoping that it works correctly. That only works very well for like tissue stuff, joints, tendons, ligaments, low back injuries. I find that those types of modalities work pretty well, especially if you're an athlete or somebody who really takes care of yourself. You're going to respond pretty good to that sort of stuff. But there are some people that respond to PMF and that sort of stuff for like neurological stuff or brain stuff and things of that nature. That's a lot more hit or miss because of this concept that maybe their filter, their biology is kind of broken. So then when you hit it with a PMF, it kind of fixes itself, but sometimes it doesn't. And the reason isn't because of the technology, it's because of the filter, the biology, right? So it's kind of shaping out kind of like this GLP-1 story where sometimes the input isn't the problem. It's the biology that it's being interacted with. Now, because of what I've read about frequencies and all these stuff, like there's probably going to be a time where we can actually decipher, oh, you're having this negative response or no response to this PMF. It's because it's in the wrong frequency to dictate a neurological problem to try to fix that. So you're going to have to modulate that frequency, but we don't know that yet. There needs to be more work done with that.
What's funny about that is that makes the perfect case for what's said about the Leptin coils, because those, as opposed to PEMF, which is a little bit more targeted, is a massive, like, broad energy field of different frequencies, meaning that it would make more sense that whatever you're lacking in, whatever's not matching the frequency it should, could theoretically absorb one of the many frequencies and then bring itself back to the proper resonance. But again, we need much more time to study this and to really look into developing the technology to apply it more specifically. David, this has been an amazing hour and almost 15 minutes of just crazy deep dive that I feel like everybody's going to have to listen to 2 or 3 times to keep writing everything down to make sure they didn't miss anything. Now, as always, a podcast is the tip of the iceberg. So if we want to dive more into this, give us a little refresher on where we can find more of your work. I know the website now looks amazing. You put a bunch of updates into that. I know you have your different communities and whatnot, your Instagram. Like, where are all the places we can find you?
Yeah. So for just like broad information, kind of like podcast style stuff, my Instagram's kind of has a lot of that stuff in it. My partner in crime, Eurus, we do a podcast every single week, and we have a whole free YouTube where it's a lot of stuff like this, where some of it, we usually try to stick to like one subject, like maybe PMF or GLP-1s, and get a little bit broader with that. People can look at that. That's for free. That's on YouTube. And it's also linked very frequently in my Instagram. Now, if you want to ask me direct questions, I actually have a one-on-one type of thing. I do have a school group that's also linked in my profile. And I hold a monthly Q&A for anybody who's in the school group and all of that type of stuff. And in the school group is all of the YouTube, that everybody can see, but also things that have been pulled off of YouTube for, how would I say, not being accepted to the main paradigm of what's allowed on social media right now. And so there's a lot of that on there. There's stuff about building biology, that sort of stuff and that has more to do with like the stuff that we talked about with GLP-1s, like, hey, you're having nighttime behavioral type architecture problems. What can we start looking at in terms of how do you monitor electromagnetic fields? There's a whole lot of that. And the monthly Q&As are gold, because a lot of that is personal questions, people actually going through their problems, and we talk about it live. We actually go, or I actually go through and actually ask them these types of questions of like, hey, where do you live? Where do you sleep? You know, and then sometimes I even do it live. I'll get on there because I have specific websites and stuff like that that I can use to remotely get a good gauge of your electromagnetic field and start pointing you in the right direction of where to look and what to do and what to test.
Awesome. And as an active member, I should be more active, but as a member of the school group myself, I can attest to literally anybody watching that it is beyond worth it. So the information is incredible, and it's constantly being updated too. David, again, thank you so much for your time. I feel like it's only a matter of weeks before people start bugging me to get you on here again, but we'll let this one marinate a little bit. Now that the channel's bigger, it'll reach a lot more people. And again, man, I'm just so appreciative of you, your knowledge, your expertise, and your willingness to provide your time. All the best in the world, and continue to do what you do.
Yeah, same to you. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Guys, this is the DDT Method Podcast. We will see you next week.